Now that you've played, you can't go back. Some stories create bonds, and those who listen to them without taking precautions can end up being followed. But there is a way to avoid this. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That's the only way to make sure he doesn't notice you. The Night of Whispers. The first sign that something was wrong came on a sweltering October night. The small town of Hollow Creek, surrounded by dense forests and a black water lake, began to feel the presence of something unknown. There were no screams, there were no sirens, just the sound of the wind cutting through the trees and whispers. The first disappearances were subtle. A child who didn't come home, a dog that howled into the darkness and was never seen again. But when the entire Calloway family was found sitting at their dinner table with their eyes gouged out and an inhuman murmur echoing in their still chests, the town understood that something indescribable was happening. The zombies didn't move like they did in the movies. They didn't stagger, nor did they run madly. They walked slowly, their white eyes empty, their lips slightly parted as they whispered words that no one could understand. The sound was hypnotizing, penetrating the minds of the victims, filling them with a paralyzing terror. Will Carter, the sheriff, was one of the first to notice the pattern. The victims weren't violently attacked, but stood motionless, wide-eyed, listening to the whispers until their own flesh began to fall apart. It was as if the words brought death, emptying their souls even before their bodies gave way. Together with a group of survivors, Will locked himself in the old police station. The radio was silent. The telephone only emitted static, but outside they could hear the whispers. The voices came from all sides, crawling across the ground like fog. Sarah Jennings, a young teacher, covered her ears with tape. "Don't listen. If you listen, they'll get into your head," she shouted as the others tried to ignore the growing fear. But it was useless. The zombies didn't need to break into the building to take over the police station. The words came in through every crack, through every shadow. Mark, one of the police officers, began to mutter to himself. His nose was bleeding, his eyes turned white, and then, without warning, he turned to the others and whispered a single word. Everyone fell to the ground, writhing, as something invisible pulled them beyond sanity. Will tried to run, tried to escape. But when he looked out into the street, he saw that the entire town was there, waiting. Men, women, children, all motionless, with mouths slightly open, murmuring those words that should not be heard. The sheriff covered his ears, ran back inside the building, tried to find refuge, but it was too late. When he looked in the mirror, he saw that his own lips were moving. He was whispering, and then he understood. There was no escape. There never had been. The town of Hollow Creek was dead, and now the whispers had one more voice to join the eternal chorus of the night. The Hospital of Living Flesh. The corridors of St. Benedict's Hospital were dark and silent when the group of survivors found refuge there. The city outside was already in ruins, taken over by creatures that moved in disturbing and unfamiliar ways. But inside that abandoned hospital, something worse awaited them. At first it seemed safe. The doors were locked and there were no signs of movement on the lower floors. But the smell, a putrid odor of mold and rust, permeated the walls. Alice, a former nurse at the hospital, felt her stomach churn. Something was very wrong there. On the second night, they heard the first sounds. They weren't moans or screams. They were murmurs, drawn-out words that seemed to echo from inside the walls. Ethan, one of the survivors, followed the echo to the surgical floor and saw something disturbing. In the center of the room, a motionless figure lay on the operating table. Its body was covered in bandages and irregular stitches, as if someone had been trying to reconstruct it. But the worst thing was the movement. The stitches seemed to twitch slightly, as if something was awakening. And then the eyes opened. Alice tried to pull Ethan away, but it was too late. The figure rose with a strange crack, as if its joints had been improvised. Its face was a collage of shadows and fragments of expression, and when it spoke, the voice was not just one, but several at the same time. "Stay with us." The corridors filled with distorted shadows, with figures that crawled across the floor, their forms cloaked and movements erratic. The hospital was not just a refuge, it was a place where something inexplicable had occurred, giving rise to something that should never exist. One by one, the survivors felt the creature's increasingly dense and suffocating presence. Alice was the last to fight, running to the elevator, frantically pressing the button. But when the doors opened, she saw her own reflection. Her face, her eyes were no longer hers. At St. Benedict's Hospital, no one ever left unscathed. They just changed. And their voices, now united with the macabre chorus of the night, echoed through the endless corridors. Endless hunger. The first attack was too fast for anyone to react. There were no previous signs, no traditional moans of the dead, nor the slow, clumsy gait that so many stories had described. They were fast, calculating, and hungry beyond comprehension. The world watched in horror as cities were decimated in a matter of days. The infected never decomposed, never stopped. Their bodies somehow regenerated, keeping them eternally hunters, always lurking, always learning. Each new hunt made them more efficient, more lethal. In the beginning, humanity believed it could resist. They created safe zones, erected barriers, and relied on weapons. But the zombies began to understand. They didn't need to tear down walls if they could wait for the humans to falter. They studied, adapted, they learned, and then came the greater horror. It wasn't just an infection transmitted by bites or scratches. Some humans simply began to change. No injuries, no contact with the infected. First, extreme insomnia. Then, an insatiable appetite that no food could satisfy. And finally, a sudden awakening to a new reality. They weren't just hungry, they were transforming. The biologist Henry Lasseter was the first to notice. In an underground laboratory, he analyzed blood samples from one of the survivors and saw something impossible. The mutation didn't come from a common virus. It was something deeper, something that spread through the air, through the water, through fear itself. Hunger was the true contamination, a growing and uncontrolled desire that, once activated, could not be reversed. Gradually, the lines between the living and the dead began to blur. Those who were still breathing but were consumed by hunger began to hunt their own friends, their own families. They ate without thinking, without remembering who they were before. The world didn't fall into ruins due to the traditional zombie apocalypse. It fell because no one could trust themselves. And as the last pockets of survivors hid in the shadows, trying to avoid both the immortal hunters and the humans on the verge of changing, a whisper began to echo across the devastated lands. Hunger never ends. It only grows. Henry, the last scientist, locked himself in his laboratory, surrounded by armored walls and months of supplies. But on the final night, he realized that he no longer felt tired, he no longer felt thirsty, only hunger, a hunger that grew, devouring his sanity. With trembling hands, he took his last ampule of cyanide, knowing it was the only way out. But before he could bring it to his lips, his reflection in the glass stared back and smiled. He was never safe, he was never immune, and in the silence of the ruined world, only hunger remained eternal. The last express to hell. The city's last hope was on rails. Express 217 was the only chance to escape before chaos swallowed everything. 100 survivors squeezed into the carriages, eager to leave behind the streets ravaged by the unknown. When the train whistled and began to move, an almost palpable relief swept through the air, heavy with fear. But salvation was short-lived. The first victim was a man in a grey suit in carriage 3. He simply fell from his seat, convulsing, his skin paling before the horrified eyes of the other passengers. When his eyes opened, there was something strange about them. He hadn't been injured, there were no signs of infection, but something inside him had changed. He attacked the woman next to him, throwing the carriage into chaos. The driver, alerted by the noise, locked the carriages behind to prevent the confusion from spreading. But it was too late. The situation inside the train became uncontrollable. Passengers began to act strangely, as if something invisible was affecting them, making them uncontrollable. Dr. Evelyn Carter, one of the passengers, realized the frightening truth. It wasn't a virus, it wasn't a traditional infection. Something in the very air of the train was altering the passengers' minds. An invisible force, perhaps linked to fear itself, caused those who fell into despair to lose control. The carriages became zones of panic, people trying to protect themselves, doors being forced, an atmosphere of pure tension. The few who resisted knew that the fight was useless. There was nowhere to run on a moving train. Evelyn ran to the driver's cabin, hoping to stop the train before it reached its final destination. But when she opened the door, she froze. The driver was there, motionless in his seat, eyes wide open, as if he had seen something that his mind couldn't comprehend. The train was running on its own. Outside, the horizon looked black, as if the world was disappearing. There were no stations, no visible tracks, just an absolute void. Express 217 wasn't going to a common destination. Evelyn fell to her knees, feeling an overwhelming pressure on her chest. Behind her, the last passengers looked around, bewildered. The train didn't slow down. Fear mingled with uncertainty. The last thing Evelyn saw before darkness enveloped her was the control panel. The destination marker flashed just one word: Hell, the cult of the resurrected. The world had plunged into chaos. The zombie apocalypse had consumed entire civilizations, leaving only isolated pockets of survivors, hidden and desperate. It was in these shadows that faith found new meaning. Rumors of a safe haven spread like wildfire. A community surrounded by high walls and protected by a group known as the Resurrected promised shelter and safety in exchange for devotion. For those who had spent weeks fleeing death, it seemed like the only option. Jonas and his younger sister Emily were guided to the gates of the sanctuary. Men and women dressed in grey robes greeted them with serene smiles. Here, hunger and fear do not exist, they said. And indeed, the fortress seemed untouched by the apocalypse. There were no signs of zombies, no rotting bodies. It was a miracle amid the desolation. But soon the signs of something wrong began to appear. On the first night, Jonas heard chants coming from the great central hall. Echoes of deep voices rose in the darkness, intoning words in an unknown language. Curious, he peeked through a crack in the door and saw the members of the cult kneeling around a stone altar. In the center, one of the newcomers lay motionless. One of the leaders, a man with white eyes and overly pale skin, murmured something as he slid a blade across the sacrificed's throat. But the scariest thing came after. The blood was collected in a cup and drunk by those present. And then one of the bodies lying in a corner of the room moved. First the fingers, then the head. It rose slowly, eyes empty, but its skin wasn't rotten like that of the zombies outside. It was as if it had returned, different. Jonas recoiled in horror. They weren't just a cult. They were something beyond life and death. The next morning he tried to convince Emily to flee, but her eyes were already consumed by fanaticism. They really protect us, Jonas. It's safe here. They have the power to stop death. Don't you want to live forever? He realized too late. The cult didn't just welcome survivors. It transformed them. That night, Jonas tried to escape. He ran to the gates, but was captured. The cult leader smiled, his teeth stained red. Faith demands sacrifices, my son, and now you will be one of us. He felt icy hands hold him, pulling him towards the altar. The chanting increased, deep, reverberating as a sharp pain tore through his skin. His vision blurred, his breathing became shallow. And then something changed. When his eyes opened again, the pain was gone. His skin was cold, but he felt a growing power within him. Around him, the resurrected watched him with welcoming smiles. Emily held his hand, her eyes shining with euphoria. Jonas tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth, only a guttural, deep, inhuman whisper. He was no longer Jonas. He was one of them, the cradle of blood, The storm raged outside, throwing lightning that illuminated the grotesque silhouette of the abandoned maternity ward. The group of survivors, exhausted and desperate, forced the rusty door and entered the building in search of shelter. The smell of mold and expired medicine permeated the air. It was a dead place, hastily left when the world crumbled. They advanced through the dark corridors, illuminated only by trembling lanterns. And then they heard it, a cry, low, continuous, coming from the depths of the hospital. The survivors looked at each other, stunned. There shouldn't be anyone there. Children shouldn't have withstood the devastation. But the weak, almost pleading groans dragged through the corridors like a macabre melody. Marta, a former nurse, followed the sound to an isolated ward where dusty cribs were arranged in rows. At the back of the room, a small body struggled under an old blanket. She hesitated, but instinct took over. As she pulled back the fabric, she found a baby with huge eyes shining under the light of the lantern. The relief lasted an instant. The child's skin was as cold as marble. Its eyes, black as bottomless pits, didn't blink. A shiver ran down Marta, and she took a step back. The cry echoed again, now multiplied. The other cribs trembled. Blankets fell to the floor, revealing dozens of small, motionless bodies, their silhouettes distorted by the dim light. The air became heavy, as if something invisible filled the room. Jorge, one of the survivors, recoiled, pulling out his weapon. "This isn't right," he muttered, trying to contain his panic. The door behind the group slammed shut on its own. Marta held the lantern with trembling hands and saw what was beyond the cribs. On the wall at the back, words scribbled in faded paint formed an unsettling sentence. Born of silence, forgotten by time. Before they could react, a rush of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing the lantern light. The crying ceased immediately, plunging them into absolute silence. Then, a sound arose in the darkness. A low, weak, childish laugh. The lantern flickered for an instant, and when it came back on, the cribs were empty. The survivors looked at each other, their panic turning into pure terror. Something was there with them, something that should never have been left behind. Without waiting any longer, they ran towards the exit, pushing doors and stumbling over the rubble. But the storm outside seemed to have become more intense, as if the world beyond the maternity ward was closing in on them. When they finally reached the gates, Marta looked back one last time. The lightning revealed small silhouettes lined up in the corridors, watching them. And then, in a whisper carried by the wind, the words echoed again. "Have you come to take us away? Now, we will go with you." The door opened on its own. The survivors turned to run, but it was too late. Something was pulling them back, like invisible hands holding their clothes, their skin. The wind roared around them, and the storm seemed to swallow the world beyond the maternity ward. One by one, they were swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, the storm had ceased. The building remained there, solemn and still. Nothing indicated that anyone had passed through there, until inside the crib ward, the cries began again. But now, among the children's voices, something different could be heard. Adult voices whispering, trapped forever in the cradle of blood.